dangerous except after the Constitution of the United States, the Bill of Rights printed in metal in my shirt pocket, which they never did find the metal detector on. And I got out to the gate and they said, no ID, no flying. And I said, so can you show me the rule that says I can't fly without ID? And they couldn't. But they wouldn't let me on the plane anyway. And it was a full flight. They put somebody else on instead of me as a standby. And then, they dealt with me after it had left. And the supervisor who dealt with me came back to me and said, we didn't fly you because you said you had an ID and you didn't show it. I said, well, does this mean if I had just forgotten it and left it at home, you would have let me on the plane? I said, no, I didn't say that. But he wouldn't elaborate. And since then, I've had friends who have gone to airports and gone, oh, damn, I left my ID at home. And they let them right on through anyway. They even put a notation on their record so that they can fly back without the ID. So clearly, whatever the rules are, they're not exactly what the signs say. The rules are flexible somehow for certain people. They weren't flexible for me. So after getting bounced in Oakland, I took a taxi to the San Francisco airport and walked up to the United counter and said, I want to buy a ticket on the next flight to Washington. He said, well, that's going to be expensive, sir. Well, okay, tell me how much it is. It was like $1,200. I had brought $1,200 in cash along just in case. And so they said, okay, so show me your ID. And I said, no. And we went through the usual round of escalation. Eventually they called the supervisor, I asked the supervisor, so what's this rule? I understand you won't sell me a ticket because of this, but I want to see where this rule is written down. And he went off and got his supervisor. Eventually what we got was the ground security chief for United in San Francisco. And he came out and talked to me and said, well, I can't tell you off the top of my head, but I'll go back behind the counter and research it. It might take me 10 or 15 minutes. And so he did. And he came back out and said, sir, you're right. You don't have to show an ID to get on an airplane. Here's the deal. If you won't show an ID, we have to put you through a special search. And this involves, pat-down search of your body and going through all of your bags in great detail, etc. He said, he didn't say you have to do this. He said, you will be subject to a search. What makes me subject to a search? I don't consent to the search. It'd be more than the usual search that everybody has to go through. And he said, well, we still can't tell you we can't show you the rule, but you either have to get searched or you have to show an ID. You have to go through a special search or show an ID. So this was all even more puzzling. So a couple of weeks later, I filed a lawsuit in the San Francisco Federal District Court. And the lawsuit is against Attorney General John Ashcroft, who runs the Justice Department, who makes the list of people who aren't allowed to fly.
Under what legislation does that list exist?
Under none that we can find. Under what legislation? And the Department of Homeland Security and United and Southwest Airlines and various other folks. So, what's happened with the case is the government, well, the first thing that happened is United went into bankruptcy. And when you go into bankruptcy, you immediately, all court proceedings involving you except the bankruptcy get stayed. They go on hold to see if you're still alive later. look at the facts of the situation because under the law he's wrong. It's a standard motion that everybody files at the beginning of the case to try to throw out the other guy's case. And so we swapped paperwork back and forth on that for a few months, and then we held a hearing in January of this year in federal court. And you got a pretty good turnout of people and orders and stuff at the hearing. And at this hearing, the judge spent more than an hour listening to both sides and asking them both tough questions. The toughest question for the other side was the other side, the government side, basically kept saying, everybody knows what these rules are. The whole purpose of this is the safety of air travel. And the rules are you can't carry weapons or explosives on the airplanes. And the judge kind of went, okay, I understand that that's the rule. Now what's the rule about identification? Well, the rule is you can't carry weapons. We're asking for ID as part of trying to identify people carrying weapons or explosives. Because it turns out they have a list of people who are suspected of carrying weapons or explosives occasionally. And it's called the no-fly list. And if your name is on this list, then the airlines are required by a law to not let you fly. It's one of these Airline Safety and Security Act of something or other laws. But nowhere in that law does it say that passengers are required to provide an ID in order to fly. And nowhere in the published regulations that I could find was there any such requirement. Well, so ultimately, the judge kept pushing the government on this. It's like, okay, so what's the rule about ID that everybody should know here? And he said, well, if you're asking for the contents of the secret directive, I can't show it to you. And that sort of, made the main point of what we were trying to get through here. On the other hand, she asked us a bunch of tough questions, one of which was, what are you really concerned about here? Right? You complained about the secret law, you complained about having to show ID, you complained about being searched if you don't show ID, you complained about these lists of people who aren't allowed to fly, you complained about the government tracking these IDs to track all the citizens. What do you really care about here? And I said, having ID demanded to travel in my own country. Right? It's the your papers please thing. Right? You get to the checkpoint, and they don't let you through unless your papers are in order. Well, in the United States, you're not supposed to need papers to go from place to place inside the country. Somehow, they want a card issued by the government that gives you the right to move from place to place inside the country. And they have armed guards between you and the plane to make sure if you don't have that card, you can't get on. So this is sort of a fundamental conflict I'm trying to address. And a bunch of the other questions that the judge had were technical things about the law. It turns out most of the time when you're appealing the results of an agency, of a decision of the FAA or the TSA or whatever, you're supposed to start in an appeals court instead of a district court, which is sort of one level closer to the Supreme Court. But that applies like if you're a pilot and they took your license away. You go to an appeals court if you're appealing their administrative decision. But it doesn't apply if you're making a constitutional challenge to the whole basis of the rules. So we argue, no, it belongs in this court, the government's arguing, no, it belongs in that court. They're just trying to shuffle it around and wear us out. And ultimately, what happened was the judge said, this is all very interesting. I'm not going to rule today, and I'll think about it and issue a written ruling. And that was 8 months ago. And she hasn't decided yet. Now, I see this as a good sign. Because I think if she was going to throw the case out, she'd have thrown it out quickly. But instead, she's actually poking into the details and figuring out how much of a case do we have. You know, we asked for relief on about 6 different reasons, and I'll get into some of those later. And she may decide, well, you get to, you know, you have a real challenge about the secret law, but I don't know about this First Amendment, you know, or Fourth Amendment, so those I'm not going to allow now to do that. And so she's figuring that out. Eventually she will tell us. And then we will get to file a motion in the case. And we're still working out what we'll do there. We'll either be asking for more information out of the government on what it's actually doing to people, what it claims the rules are, which is called a discovery request. It's getting documents from the other side to help the court come to the truth about what's really happening. Or we'll make a motion that says, well, it doesn't really matter what rules they invented here. According to the law, as we understand it, no set of rules could be valid if it says it has these effects. And we'll get to that once the judge says how much of the case we have left. Even if the judge says we have no case, we'll end up going to the appeals court. And we can ask the same questions up there. And ultimately, if the appeals court turns us down, we could attempt to go to the Supreme Court, which gets to decide whether we make our case or not. I think it's more likely this stuff will get settled at some of the lower court levels. It's how the system is designed to work. So, a lot of what I want to go to here is something that's universal, should be universal across all of our societies, and that's the presumption of innocence. That's the presumption that if somebody's just walking around on the streets, or going about their business, or going from city to city, or at their job, or in their home, the presumption is they haven't done anything wrong. They are not a criminal. They are a citizen. They have all the rights of a citizen. And you can't just do things to them as if you had evidence that they were a criminal, because you don't have any evidence. Well, that presumption has been turned on its head in many ways in American society today. Some of that has been a reaction to 9/11, but as I said, they instituted this rule in the mid-90s. There's been a whole culture of trying to eliminate the presumption of innocence for many years. And this is a little corner of it. But it's a little corner where I thought I could get some traction. And here's why. First, secret law, there's a maxim in American law that says secret law is an abomination. It's the idea that the government can make rules and punish you for breaking those rules without ever telling you what the rules are. As you can see, that sort of system is wide open for abuse. Because the government can pick and choose who it applies these rules to. You're never really sure if you broke them or not, since they don't let you see what the rules were. So you can't really defend yourself against them. So it makes a mockery of the whole idea of rule of law as opposed to rule of whoever happens to be in power. And that's the current state of the airport security law. There's no law passed by Congress that says you have to show ID. There is no regulation issued by any government agency that I can find that says you have to show ID. But somehow every airport is plastered with signs that say the Federal Aviation Administration requires that you show identification. So somebody in there is lying. And I'm going to find out. Now, I sent in a Freedom of Information request some years back to try to get to the heart of this. And sent it to the Federal Aviation Administration, which this function has now been taken over by TSA, the Transportation Security Agency. At the time it was the FAA. And I sent in a request for, all documents and information they had about what made people show ID in airports. And what they sent back was a letter that said, well, we have issued some security directives to the airlines that require them to ask people for identification. But the passengers aren't actually required to provide it. Now, and we can't show you those orders we gave to the airlines because we have a law over here passed in the dark of night by Congress one day that says anything that relates to airport security regulations can be withheld from the public. So they admitted that they ordered the airlines to demand ID. And the second thing this letter said was that if people don't show ID, it's up to the airlines. The airlines have their own policy as to what to do, what alternative security measures to take to ensure the security of their planes. So it turned out, the FAA was basically saying, look, it's not us, it's the airlines. They did it. This is why I sued them both. Right? The airlines, when you walk up to the counter, will say, it's an FAA regulation, you have to show this. And so they're each passing the buck to the other, and now they're both on the spot, and one or the other will get caught. And this is the guy that made this regulation. So I think the secret law business is another thing that should be universal to European law, to American law, and to any civilized country. Maybe 15 years ago, it wasn't true in this particular spot on the planet when it was part of East Germany. But it should be true here now, that there aren't any secret laws in effect. Okay, so I've gone through this whole prologue. You're probably wondering, what the hell is wrong with this guy? Why don't we just show this guy an ID card? Right? What's wrong with showing your ID every time you fly? Well, the first thing that's wrong with it is, in the district where I live, in California, the appeals court for California and 7 or 8 other states is the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And over the last 10 to 12 years, there have been 3 different cases in that court which have established the policy for that district of the United States. And the policy is that any law that where the government demands an ID from somebody who they have no evidence of criminality from violates their Fourth Amendment right to not be unreasonably searched. I mean, to shrink that down into a soundbite, the demand for ID is a search. Right? Cops are allowed to look at you as you walk around, but they're not allowed to search you. And the demand that you take something out of your pocket so that they can look at it is a search. Okay? They're allowed to search people under certain circumstances. They're allowed to, if they have stopped you and they're talking to you about something for a minute or a couple of minutes, they're allowed to pat down the outside of your clothing to make sure that you have no suspicious bulges that might be a gun you could whip out and shoot them. They're not allowed to poke their hands in the pockets, but they're allowed to pat you down for weapons. Okay, that's an exception that the courts have permitted for the safety of police officers and the general order of society. They say that's a reasonable search, not an unreasonable one. When you go in through an airport or into some of the federal buildings, they make you go through a frame, a magnetometer that looks for weapons, and maybe run your stuff through an X-ray machine. There was a court case about that when they put it in the 1980s in this same court called U.S. versus Davis. This guy Davis objected to being searched when he walked through an airport because the rest of his whole life he walked through the airports and nobody searched him. He thought this was unconstitutional to search him. He was innocent. And the courts cut out a little notch out of the Fourth Amendment and said, for purposes of keeping weapons and explosives off airplanes, and for no other purpose whatsoever, it's okay to subject people to the very minimal search required to do that. Even though the person is not suspected of any crime, etc. That's okay. It's okay to do the very minimal search only for weapons or explosives. And so this is why in the United States, every time you walk through, you have to go through this, because the court and the Ninth Circuit decided that, and the Supreme Court blessed it. But what does a demand for ID have to do with weapons or explosives, right? I'm going to walk through the Magna Tower anyway. They're going to X-ray me anyway, whether or not I show an ID. If I have no weapons or explosives, what's this deal with the ID? And the deal with the ID is 3 cases have shown that it's unconstitutional. Well, the first of those cases was a California law that said, upon demand by any peace officer, which is their name for a policeman, the person is required to produce credible and reliable identification. And this was the law for 8 or 10 years in California. But it got applied one too many times to a particular man that he got mad about. This was a black man, originally from Africa, I believe, educated at Oxford, and who had moved to the United States. Rather unusual looking man. He was quite tall, had dreadlocks down to his ass, and dressed in white ice cream suits. And he liked to walk around a lot. He didn't drive. He liked to walk around a lot, and he liked to hitchhike. And so a guy like this walking through random, particularly white neighborhoods in Los Angeles and San Diego was like a magnet to the police. And he was stopped something like 22 times over a period of a couple of years by cops. And on 4 or 5 of those occasions, they said, I demand that you show ID. And he said, no. And they booked him on this, they arrested him under this law that says you have to show an ID. And, once they arrested him and searched his body, they found that he had an ID. It was in his pocket. He just objected to being treated like a criminal when he was just walking around the neighborhood. And in most of those cases, they never bothered to prosecute him. They arrested him, hauled him off to jail for the night or whatever, let him go. But in one of them, they actually prosecuted him, and he served time in jail for a couple of weeks or something for walking around without showing ID on the man. And he appealed that case, and appealed it up through the California courts. And what happened was the California courts upheld that law. So once you've exhausted your appeals to the California courts, you can jump over into the federal courts if you think there's a constitutional right involved. And he jumped over into the federal courts, and by the way, he was acting as his own lawyer during that time. And I know several people who went to UC Berkeley to the law school who would see him going in and out of the library. You really couldn't miss this guy. If he walked within 100 yards of you, it's like, who is that guy? And so they remember seeing him go in and out of the law library doing his research on his case. But he eventually got help from the ACLU, and he won his case in the Ninth Circuit. And the Ninth Circuit said that any law, that the idea of this law was counter to the basic premise of the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment says that everyone shall be free of being unreasonably searched or seized. Seized in this case means not being able to move around, like being restrained. And that applies to your papers and your person and your home and such. Okay. So, what the Ninth Circuit said was this law is an attempt to get around the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment says if there's probable cause to believe that a crime has been committed and that you were involved, the cops can go to a judge, get a warrant, or if they see the crime happening, they can do it right there without a warrant, and then they can search you, and that's reasonable. And so the requirement that they either see you commit a crime, or if they go through a neutral judge, sort of is a check on the power of the government to just arbitrarily search anybody at any time. And what the court said was, this law makes a criminal out of anyone who refuses to search. Right? So if a cop comes up and asks you, can I search you? And you say yes, then they get to search you. Because you agree. And if the cop walks up to you and asks, can I search you? And you say no, then you're a criminal and they've seen you commit a crime and they can search you. And they thought that was a bad idea, so they said that was an unconstitutional law. So the Ninth Circuit struck down that law for two reasons. First, because of the search thing, and second, because the law was vague. There's a doctrine that says not only the laws have to be published, but if you read them, you actually have to be able to tell what you're supposed to do. So this law said you needed to provide credible and reliable identification. What does that mean? Is a library card okay? How about a passport from the former Soviet Union? What about my college student ID? Right? If I don't drive a car, is my birth certificate okay? And none of this was clear, with the result that people walking around had no idea whether they were committing a crime or not, by not having enough identity cards in their possession. And so it was struck down on both of these rules. Well, the government appealed, because they liked having this law around. It was tidy for arresting people they didn't like. And the Supreme Court took the case and ultimately affirmed the Ninth Circuit. They didn't even look at the Fourth Amendment issue. They basically said, the Ninth Circuit is right, this law is vague. People can't tell what credible and reliable ID is, so we're going to uphold it. And as long as they found one reason to say the law is unconstitutional, they don't have to think up all the reasons it might be unconstitutional. So in the whole country, vague laws that require you to show ID are unconstitutional. And in the Ninth Circuit, such laws also violate the Fourth Amendment. Okay. Now, some governments didn't actually believe this. They kept trying to pass laws that made you show ID. And Nevada is in the next door state. And they had a guy in a casino who was accused of cheating by the management, and the management took the guy up into one of their back offices and confronted him and said, "We think you're cheating," and the guy said, "No, I'm not, I'm innocent." He said, "We want to see some ID," and he said, "No." And they called the cops, and the cops asked for ID, and the guy said no. And the cops arrested him under some law, similar law. And the Ninth Circuit struck that law down too when these guys appealed. And there was a third case, similar. But basically, the courts have consistently said over a period of more than a decade that if a government agent demands identification from you without reason to suspect you of any crime, it's unconstitutional. Now, what's the difference between walking into a casino without an ID and walking into an airport without an ID? What's the difference between walking into an airport without ID and walking down the street without an ID? Or getting onto a bus or getting onto a train? Well, in the eyes of the Constitution, there ought to be no difference. I say. And we'll see what the courts say. Any questions about this part so far? There's lots of other reasons why this. Yeah. Do we want to run the mics, or I want to repeat your question?
Just checking. Okay. Isn't United a private airline that can do whatever they want to, request to share ID or get out on the plane.
Yes, United is a private company, but United is operating under regulation by the federal government of the United States. And in particular, when I walk up to United and they say, the Federal Aviation Administration requires you to show ID, then I say there's federal government involvement. The federal government has to follow the Constitution. The federal government can't make a rule that says companies are required to violate the Constitution. You know, if they're not allowed to do it themselves, they can't delegate somebody else to do it. And as it turns out, all of the other airport search-related cases, like the Davis case with the guy with the X-ray machine, went in assuming that the federal government was involved and that basically you had to do this constitutionally. You know, you couldn't just line up a bank of private companies between you and every form of transportation. They could demand anything they wanted of you. The public deserves better than that somehow. Anybody else? Over here? Thank you.
In the case with X-raying, you said that the court, in the case with X-raying on the airport.
Oh, the X-rays, yeah.
You said that the court decided on this exception that they were allowed to use it. So the court had the right to change the text of the law.
The court does not have the right to change the text of a law, nor can it change the text of the Constitution, but it can change how these things are interpreted. And in particular, the Constitution is a very short document, and clearly, you know, couldn't come up with detailed rules for every situation. So the courts, and the courts don't actually like to sort of make general rules about what the Constitution says, because every time they do that, they get into trouble. So what they say, what the courts do in the United States is they will only apply the law to a specific situation of facts. Like me standing in that airport confronting that clerk who wouldn't sell me a ticket because of that rule. And they will say whether in that situation my rights were violated or not. And then, based on an accumulation of cases like this, and cases similar and cases different, you can sort of get an idea of where the vague boundaries of your rights are. But of course, you know, anytime there's a new situation, the only way to tell really what your rights are is to put it in front of a court. In the back.
What would you have done if the guy from United said, it's not the law to show you ID, but it's our policy that we don't transport people without ID?
What would I have done at that point? I would still file the case, you know, and work through the court process to see if they were lying to me or not. But there's a further bit here, which is United and all the other airlines are common carriers. Being a common carrier is a particular type of regulated private business that provides some advantages to the company and some disadvantages. The advantages to the company are they are not liable for anything their customers do. So trucking companies, for example, are common carriers. Bus companies are common carriers. If you send some dangerous object on a truck, you are responsible for that. The trucking company is not. Right? Then no one can haul them into court and make them go to prison for shipping weapons across the border or something. Because they're a common carrier and they get protection from that. But in return for that protection, they have to file public rules that say what the rules are. And so these are filed with the government so anyone can see what the rules are. And they have to provide service to anybody who walks up and follows those rules. They have to publish what the prices are, what the terms are, and they can't discriminate between you and you and you and say, we'll let you send the package at that rate, and we're going to charge this other guy a different rate, and this guy we're not going to let him send packages at all because we don't like his politics. Or he shipped with our competitor last week, and so we're just going to punish it. And so common carrier being regulated that way can't just make up arbitrary rules about who it's going to serve. The rules have to be consistent so that the whole public gets served. They can't just decide. People who wore their hat turned backwards can't get on an airplane. They can't decide that people whose skin color is this aren't allowed to get on a bus or send packages, etc. So, common carrier law is not something I'm an expert on. I know a lot more. I'm not a lawyer at all, but I've spent a lot of time working on constitutional law. But even if you get around the Constitution, there's this common carrier problem that would still need exploring. Question here?
Does that make a difference?
Oh.
Do they make a difference between foreigners and Americans? I mean, would we be obliged to show our passports, whereas if you succeed with your law, the case would not? Or is the Constitution valid for all?
In general, the Constitution is valid for every person lawfully admitted to the United States. So, if you got to the border and they let you in, then you have most of the rights of an American citizen. You don't get to vote and things like that, but they can't arbitrarily stop and search you, etc. And the exact contours of where those rights are again subject to individual court cases that have happened over the years. But if you have snuck across the border, on the other hand, you have no rights in that sense. If they can catch you at it, they can kick you out and they can search you and various other things. Yes.
Well, I have a follow-on question to this thing with the common carriers. I don't know the English word, but in Germany there's something like Sorgfaltspflicht, which means that carriers do have to ensure at least some basic checks. So if you go up to a carrier company and say, hey, I have Munich, could you please fly to the center of Munich? So they have to object. And I find it hard to believe that there's no such thing in America.
I think what you're saying is if you do something obviously illegal through a common carrier, they're supposed to object. Yeah, this is generally true. They have the right to say, one of their rules is, you're not allowed to ship illegal things, dangerous objects, etc. If they think you're doing that, they can stop you. But if you just walk up as an innocent citizen and you don't have any obvious guns, bombs, chemical weapons or anything else, then they're supposed to take your pack. Okay, why don't I go on and talk about some of the other aspects? Give our right runner a rest. So besides this business of the demand for ID being a search, there's also an issue of anonymity and what anonymity protects in society and sort of how it ties into the structure of rights. And part of the reason that anonymity gets special treatment in American society, this may be less true in other countries, it's because the people who founded the country frequently met anonymously and wrote anonymously because had they identified themselves, they would have been arrested or shot by King George's men before they could make it into their own country. And so the Federalist Papers, which was an explanation of why people should vote to bring the Constitution into effect, for example, were written pseudonymously, and it was only later discovered that it was Alexander Hamilton and various other well-known people who had written it. Lots of famous, not only political screeds, but newspapers and pamphlets and all sorts of other things published anonymously. So there's a history from the founding of the country of protecting anonymity because it protects people's right to disagree, it protects the right to dissent, and to not be penalized for disagreeing with the majority. And besides applying in times 200 or 300 years ago, this stuff has also been applied in recent cases. The very most recent case in the Supreme Court about this involved a religious group called the Jehovah's Witnesses. I don't know if you have them over here. In the United States, they go door to door. Yeah. And they try to get you to believe in their version of the Bible, and they try to get you to give them money. And they do this under the guise of religious freedom and their right to try to advocate for their particular beliefs. Well, there was a small town that decided that anybody who goes door to door soliciting, which they define this to be soliciting, had to register with the city government and get a permit for this. And the Jehovah's Witnesses came in and went door to door soliciting and wouldn't go down and get a permit because they were doing this separation of church and state thing. Like, we don't need to go, to Rome and get permission because we are a church. We're religious. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and that ain't Caesar's. And so the city busted them for this, and they took this case, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and ultimately the Supreme Court decided that these people have the right to anonymously. Oh yeah, part of the deal was when you registered with the city, you had to give them a name and address and your phone number, and address, blah blah blah. It was all they wanted to build a dossier about you in case you went around breaking windows or stealing lawn furniture or something. So the Supreme Court ultimately decided that these people have the right to anonymously walk around and advocate for their religious beliefs and solicit donations. And that was in like 2000 or 2001, I think. There was a case a few years earlier than that where a woman in another small town was upset at what was happening with the school board. The public schools are run by a board elected by the people, and the school board was doing something she didn't like. And she published a pamphlet and had kids went out and handed it out to people, and she put it under people's on people's car windshields and stuff, and it said, you shouldn't re-elect this school board because they did this bad thing. And this was small town politics. The school board was all buddy-buddy with the cops and the mayor and all of this. And they, the cops there arrested her, or charged her at least with the crime of publishing handbills that didn't have identifying information about who had put them out. They put out this little town law that said you had to identify yourself when putting out publications. And same deal went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said you can't demand that people identify themselves to put out handbills because that would stifle, it would limit the amount of speech that gets published. It would discourage people from expressing their opinion because they would be identified with that speech, and people would burn crosses on their lawn or throw dog shit into their house or whatever. And similar, so that these all relate to acts of speech and publication. There's also anonymity protected in the right of association or the right of assembly. The First Amendment talks about, it doesn't actually say you have freedom of association freedom of assembly, speech, religion, the press, and assembly. Assembly means getting several people together in the same place at the same time. And that the courts have generalized that into a right of free association. You're allowed to associate with whoever you want. And they can't say this person is not allowed to meet with that person. Well, at some point back in the 1940s or early 50s, one of the southern states, I think it was Tennessee, one of the racist states during the era before the civil rights were all worked out for black people, passed a law that said any nonprofit organization that has members has to pay a tax to the state. And in order to ensure it's a tax per member, and in order to ensure compliance with this tax, the state can come in and look at the membership rolls. And so then they went to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which was one of the primary organizations at the time fighting for the rights of black people, and said, we want to make sure you paid your tax properly. And they sent these good old boy sheriffs in, who were the sort who would don a hood and go out in the dark of night and burn crosses on people's lawns and hang from trees and stuff, all under masks, and then come back in the middle of the day and be sheriffs. This was unfortunately all too popular for a time in the South. So these guys came in and asked for the membership list. And the NAACP said, no, we won't give up this membership list. And the thing went through the courts. And ultimately the Supreme Court decided that these colored people have a right to associate with each other, and they have a right to associate anonymously without being accountable to the government. Because if the membership list was available to the government, many of them would be chilled from associating, would be too afraid to associate. And we don't want the kind of society where people are afraid to associate with each other, even though they have the right to do it. Right? We don't want to have the rights be spelled out on paper that, oh yeah, of course you can do this, but in actual practice, if you do this, you get screwed. So the court said, this law is no good. You have the right to anonymously associate. Okay. Well, how can you associate with somebody else without traveling to the same place where they are? How can you assemble with somebody without being in the same place at the same time? It turns out that the right to travel is not written into the Constitution. It may be in some of the European states. It's certainly in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. It says that every person has the right to leave any country. And they also have the right to enter into their own country where they're a citizen. But the courts in the United States have found a very, very long tradition of protecting the right to travel, and they consider it one of the fundamental rights. It turns out before the Constitution existed, there was an earlier attempt to form an American government called the Articles of Confederation. And that only lasted for 5 or 10 years. It built a structure that was too weak to actually fight a war against the British. So it didn't work out and they had to replace it. But in the Articles of Confederation, they did spell out the right that the citizen of every state has the right to enter into and leave from every other state in the Union, in the country. And a Supreme Court case 100 years later cited this and said, this one particular right is what turned our little collection of 13 different colonies into a single country. Right? It's the fact that a planter from Georgia was free to go into New York and New York couldn't stop him. That he was free to go through all the states in between Georgia and New York to get to New York if he wanted to. And this was a different situation than what you folks had in Europe, where every country had the right to control the passage of people from every other country through it until just recently, the last 10 years. Right. Yeah, now, what, every citizen of the EU has a right to go through every other EU country, is that true?
You have to show ID.
You have to show it.
You have to carry ID.
You have to carry it.
And the right to be taken away from conferences, like G8 summits.
Okay, so you guys are still working this out. Yeah. So, but in the United States, this has been settled for more than 200 years. That basically you have the right to go in and out of every part of the country, no matter which part you live in, you can go to every other part, and the government can't stop you. One of the cases that litigated this was when the state of Hawaii was admitted, which is an island in the Pacific. The natives there didn't want to be flooded with people coming from the mainland, and so taking over their island and putting up strip malls and condominiums and trashing the place. And they tried to pass a law in the legislature there that said, they put limits on how many people could move in. And, the Supreme Court basically decided, sorry, if you were a country, you could do that, but you're a state, and you can't prevent people from coming in and out. The most recent case that looked at this was looked at it kind of sideways, and the issue was welfare benefits. Welfare in the United States is payments that you get if you're poor to keep you alive. And what happened was California passed a law that said people who live in California get this amount of welfare benefits. But people who moved here from a state that had less welfare benefits will only get as much as they had in their old state. This was so that people from states that didn't pay very much wouldn't be, because they were afraid that people were moving to California to get better welfare benefits. Well, the courts basically said this is an infringement of the right of these poor people to travel. Right? And once they establish residence in California, you have to treat them like every other California resident. You can't say, oh, because you traveled here, we'll treat you differently. So even in this weird sort of, the right to travel was way before the thing the court was actually deciding. The courts basically said you can't discriminate against people for traveling. You can't say this guy can, this guy can't, if this guy does, he gets treated differently. So far, no court has answered the question whether you have a right to travel anonymously. There are clearly lots of precedents that talk about speaking anonymously, publishing anonymously, and associating anonymously. None that says you have a right to travel anonymously. If I'm lucky, mine will be the first case to ask that question and the first case to get the answer. But because of the close association between travel and speech, and travel and association, and travel and assembly, I think, and my lawyers think, that the same rights should apply. That if you have the right, how can the government say you have the right to associate anonymously, but we have the right to demand that you identify yourself when you associate? If you weren't, like, let's say you wanted to go to a WTO protest in Seattle, and you didn't live in Seattle, and you wanted to assemble with all those protesters. You have the right to assemble, and you have the right to assemble anonymously. But does the government have the right to demand that you identify yourself to travel so you can assemble? I think it doesn't. The government thinks it does. And we will find out which is true. Now, some people say, well, airports are a special case, right? The few people get blown up on buses, you know, few people get hurt in buildings, but it's like they kill thousands of people using airplanes, and airplanes are different. Well, it turns out the U.S. government is trying to impose the same set of rules, not just on airplanes, but on trains, on long-distance buses, on cruise ships. The training requirement was put into place like 3 days after 9/11, right? All the passenger trains in America are run by one sort of quasi-government company called Amtrak. And they basically said, if you buy a ticket with cash, you must show an ID. If you buy a ticket with a credit card, we'll take your credit card as ID. And if you walk into an Amtrak station and try to buy a ticket with cash, they won't sell it to you. On buses, there are many different private buses, so there are two major national networks, Greyhound and Trailways, and a bunch of regional ones. There, the rules are a bit more spotty. Some of the bus lines will ask you for ID, some of them won't. It seems to depend where you are, what time, what place. They all claim, though, that it's a government requirement. But mostly, you know, this is the clerk talking, trying to talk you into it. And so it's hard to tell if the government won't admit to issuing any of these directives to bus companies. But the government has put out a request for proposals. They allocated like $50 million for improvements to bus security. And they put out requests for proposals from people who want to spend that money doing research and deployment on systems that will make buses more secure against terrorism or something like that. And a lot of that stuff, I suspect, is going to be ID technology. You know, we'll run your car into something or other and figure out what you actually want. Cruise ships. They started applying this stuff. It took them a few months after 9/11, but then the word kind of went around the cruise industry that, and it's funny because people who had never been on a boat cruise, includes me, by the way, I've never tried this, but people who had never done it sort of had no problem with this. They assumed it was sort of like flying, oh yeah, you only have to show your ID. But people who had been taking cruises for years were used to leaving all that crap at home and just getting on the boat and ignoring their worries. And, you know, it's like, you know, all you do is eat, sleep, and be entertained and play games the entire time you're on the cruise. They didn't, you know, they could show up with no passports, no IDs, no driver's licenses. And be turned away and be really mad at the cruise lines and wrote letters to the editor of cruise magazines and all this stuff. But again, there was no law that ever said this. It's just this requirement just sort of popped up out of nowhere. Well, in the last couple of months, there was a proposed regulation by the TSA, the Transportation Security Agency. And it's all about the maritime security enhancement, blah, blah, blah. It says if they declare a code, orange, alert, or something, then, you know, it basically said the cruise lines had to check IDs on passengers. This thing has been put up as a proposal, as a proposed law, and it's attracting comments from the public. EFF has submitted some comments, and our team will be sending you some comments, etc. Somehow it's happening already, even while it's still a proposal. But, so again, the point is, they're not just trying to restrict a single mode of travel because there's a particular danger in that mode. They're trying to restrict all ways of traveling around the country. Right? You already can't travel in your car without getting an ID from the government, without passing tests and getting permission. And they want to put all the other forms of travel under a similar constraint. It also turns out that they have not only this list of people who aren't allowed to fly, but there's a second list of people. So there's the no-fly list and the selectee list. And a selectee is another of these government code words. It means someone who has been selected. So of course it says nothing about why they were selected, what they were selected for, or how to not get selected next time. So the no-fly list is, okay, both of these lists are secret. We don't know how many names are on either of them. We don't know what criteria were used to put them on. But we know the effects. The effect of being on the no-fly list is that if you come up with your ticket or your whatever, and you come up to get a boarding pass, when they punch in your ticket, the gate agent's terminal will lock up and turn bright red, basically, on the screen, and it takes a supervisor to unlock it. Right? So the gate agent cannot give you a boarding pass. Right? It's physically prevented by their computers from doing it. And when the supervisors come over, basically, they call law enforcement. And law enforcement comes and looks over your ID, typically delays you, takes you. It's not clear whether you're restrained or whether you're free to go at that point. Maybe they've got your ID and they haven't given it back. Sometimes they take you into the back offices and ask you questions. But basically, if it's like you are that person, you not just that you have the same name, you are that person who's on the watch list, on the no-fly list, then you can't get on the airplane. And there appears to be no appeal from this. So I have a really easy case. If my name was on that no-fly list, I'd say, look, I have a right to travel, you're preventing me from traveling, you know, throw away this law, throw away this non-law, and let me travel. I don't appear to be on the no-fly list because when I'm willing to show an ID, which is when I'm traveling outside my country, where I have to show passports anyway, then they let me on airplanes. So I'm clearly not on the no-fly list. It turns out there are a bunch of people who are. And again, because the whole program is secret, it's been hard to figure out. The only way to figure out what's happening is by looking at isolated cases and sort of piecing together the puzzle. So here's one of the pieces. There's somebody whose name is David Nelson who's on the no-fly list. And the reason is a reporter knew somebody named David Nelson. A reporter in Oregon knew someone named David Nelson, and he kept complaining to his friend that every time he goes to the airport, he gets this 3-hour runaround before they let him on the plane. And so this reporter had an idea, and he sort of murmured around and checked on Google and looked at things, and eventually he said, let me try some other David Nelsons around Oregon. And he looked them up in the phone books, and he found all like 87 David Nelsons in Oregon, and he called them up. And everyone who was flying was having trouble. And so this was written up, I think, as an article in Salon. You can read it. It got onto NPR, National Public Radio, the following week. And the press has been having a fun time with this story ever since. I think, on one of the news shows from like 2 weeks ago, they had 3 or 4 David Nelsons, right, who all came on the show. And, hi, I'm David Nelson. I'm from Beaverton, Oregon, and I have trouble flying. Hi, I'm David Nelson. I'm from Portland, Oregon. I'm a carpenter, and I have trouble flying. I'm a suspected terrorist. And all of these people are innocent. But somehow they're having trouble. So that's what happens when you're on the no-fly list. When you're on the selectee list, what happens is supposedly you don't get any indication that anything funny is happening because of your name. Instead, you get one of these boarding passes that's coded so that the guys at the security station will make sure to search you. Right? It's this we search some people randomly search some fraction of the people. Well, if your name is on the selectee list, your searches are not random. You are searched every time you go through. And I know people who are searched blacklisting days of the 1950s, and Joe McCarthy, and if you were a suspected communist, you got kicked out of your job. You weren't allowed to work for the government. You couldn't get your veterans benefits, and blah blah blah. You would call in front of Congress to be embarrassed in front of the public, etc. In particular, the fact that most of the people who are being targeted are innocent, is bothering a lot of people. And the fact that there seems to be no way to get yourself on or off this list or find out. The only way you can find out if you're on the list is to go to an airport and see if that has to be. And that seems to show a sort of a lack of due process of law, a lack of administrative control over these lists. Even stepping aside from the question of whether it's constitutional to have a list of people who get searched every time you travel, or who are not allowed to travel at all. If there is going to be such a list, maybe there ought to be a way to say, wait, I'm an innocent guy, take me off the goddamn list. So the government has proposed a solution to the problems caused by all these innocent people getting caught on the no-fly list. Oh, and I'll say one more thing about the no-fly list. There's a couple of activists in San Francisco. They publish a magazine called War Times. They have never been arrested for anything, whatever. They just publish, a newsletter that's read by small numbers of people, and they rant about the government. And right about the time of the Iraq War, I think, they tried to fly somewhere and they got bounced. They got stopped and said, no, we can't let you on the plane. And they went to the ACLU for help. And ACLU did something interesting. Besides asking the federal government under the Freedom of Information Act for all the records they had about what went on there, they also asked San Francisco International Airport, which is a branch of the San Francisco city government, which is a part of the state of California. And there's a Public Records Act in the state of California that basically says any document the state has that you can get unless it violates someone's privacy or various other reasons. So, at the congressional level, they had already amended the Freedom of Information Act, so we couldn't get any information out about this. But they forgot to amend all the state laws. And so they got 300 pages of records out of the San Francisco Airport Police that showed that 300 some people had been stopped in the last month at SFO for the no-fly list. And they had blacked out the names of people involved to protect their privacy, but they showed this is not an isolated incident. This is happening to hundreds of people in one airport. It's not. If you add up all the other airports, this is a real problem. So when this came out and the government started getting more bad press about this, the government said, we have a solution for this. The solution is called CAPS 2. Now, CAPS 1 was this original watch list system. It's the Computer-Aided Passenger Pre-Screening System. That's what CAPS stands for. And it's this automated thing that the government puts in lists and then the screens lock up when those people try to check in. Well, CAPS 2, one of the big problems with CAPS 1 is it was just a list of names, right? It didn't have dates of birth, it didn't have driver's license numbers, it didn't have home addresses, it didn't have anything. So any David Nelson in the country went into an airport, had to get checked out, even though they probably knew that the David Nelson they were looking for was living somewhere else or had this color eyes or this kind of build. So, the government's proposed way to fix this is that every innocent traveler will be required to provide all kinds of information about themselves as a condition of travel. And then they'll check that information against the watch list, and then if you're innocent, you won't get caught. And so the information they're asking for is your full legal name, your date of birth, your home address, your street address, and your telephone number. Now, originally, about 6 months ago, the government's been talking about CAPS 2 in these little congressional briefings and things like this, but not too many details have leaked out until they published the Privacy Act notice about 6 months ago. And in the states, the Privacy Act says we have decent privacy protection for government records, but for nothing else. And the Privacy Act is what controls that. And the Privacy Act says anytime you build a system of records about the public, you have to disclose that it exists. You have to tell people how to look at their own record and how to correct the records and what purposes it will be used for and who it will be shown to, etc. And so they published what purported to be a Privacy Act notice for the CAPS 2 system. Actually, they didn't call it CAPS 2, they tried to slide it through and they called it Enhanced Passenger Screening something or other. They used a different acronym for it. But people picked up on it and figured it out. And they got back like 300 comments against it and 2 in favor. What the announcement said was that it was going to check people's credit records whenever they went through an airport. It's going to look them up in commercial databases, including credit card databases, to figure out whether this person was a real, and it would score them on a scale of 1 to 3, or 3 different colors, red, yellow, and green. The green people just get to go up on the plane and they go through the regular search. The yellow people are the selectees who get extra search. And the red people are the no-fly list who don't get on at all. But the way they were going to do this was by looking you up in your credit records. And it's like, does this mean if I bounce a check, I can't fly? You know, if I've overdrawn my bank account, or, you know, too many credit card charges came in from gambling houses, or, and what does this mean? You know, if I have no credit cards, does this mean I get to fly or I don't get to fly? The whole thing was totally up in the air and unclear as to what information they'd be using, what purpose they'd be using it for. Oh, but it was clear. It said these records of all the people who fly are going to be stored in a computer in this building in Washington, run by the TSA. And it's going to be stored from when the person makes their plane reservation until after the flight is landed. And it'll be deleted shortly after the flight is landed, except when we have a reason to keep it longer, in which case we can keep it up to 50 years. Now, on these records, this information could be shared with law enforcement agencies, intelligence agencies, credit card companies, state and local governments, airlines, travel agencies, basically anybody who they wanted to share it with, they could share it with. Oh, and you didn't have any access to it. You know, your procedure for getting access to it and getting it corrected was there wasn't one. And that was their reported Privacy Act notice, and that's why they got 200 comments against it. People thought this was outrageous. So their new amended system is not going to, right, and they want your Social Security number, which is your tax identification number that is turned into your national ID system. Because that's an easy way to look you up in all the credit card databases. So now they're not going to look you up with their Social Security number anymore because people objected to that. Instead, between your full name, date of birth, home address, and telephone number, they can get a unique match in the credit card databases for you anyway, and so then they'll look up your Social Security number out of that database. And they'll still use all that same kind of information to decide whether or not you can apply and whether or not you get searched. And so this is, this is the government's response to criticism about how badly the system is working now, is that they want to collect all this information about all the instant travelers. Now, one of the catches here is the government doesn't actually make airline reservations for people. It's like when you make an airline reservation, you don't call the government to do it. So you either call an airline or a travel agent. And those guys have their own computer systems that have all their own databases and protocols and stuff. And none of them has any field for dates of birth, home addresses, or any of that stuff. So they're somehow implicit in this proposal is the idea that these guys are going to rewrite all their software to keep all this information in the reservation system. And the government is going to demand that you provide that information, but because these travel agencies and airlines are private companies, the Privacy Act doesn't apply to them. So there's no controls on what they can do with that info once they've accumulated it from you. They can sell it to direct marketers, or they can use it to profile you, or they can, do whatever they want with it, essentially. Similarly, there's two pieces of information that happen every time somebody does a credit check on you. Right? The obvious piece of information is what comes back is your credit record. That, so the government would look at your credit record and decide whether to let you fly. The second piece of information, what you could almost think of as a covert channel, is credit card agencies get to know that the government looked you up. And they get the information you provided to the government, because the government passes it on to them to do the lookup. So now the credit card companies, every time you travel, will get your date of birth, your home address, your current telephone number, etc.
And the fact that you travel.
And the fact that you travel, and on, which flights, on which airlines, maybe or maybe not, it's hard to tell. So anyway, this doesn't look like a very good system to me. Some people are attacking it on privacy basis. I'm trying to attack it on a much more fundamental level by saying the government can't require this information of people who travel because they can't restrict people's right to travel. Right? They can't make it a precondition that you provide this before you travel, because they're not allowed to make preconditions on you can travel. And they're not allowed to demand identification because that's a search they're not allowed to do unless you're suspected of a crime. So I'm going at it at a much more fundamental kind of roots level, while everybody else is arguing about the details of, well, of course they get to ask you for this, but what do they do with it later? And what happens if you don't have a telephone number? Are you allowed to fly or not? If you're a homeless person and don't have a home address, can you move around? And again, the government was not particularly forthcoming about what happens to these records afterward. Because clearly one of the dangers in this, there's a really obvious sort of thing that happens if you can track the movements of people around the country. Is you can track your political opposition. Right? When all of those people got together and disrupted the streets of Seattle for the WTO meeting, when all those people shut down in San Francisco during when the Iraq War was declared, when all those people in Europe did big rallies against the war, etc. If the government could watch who was going to those rallies, they could then put that in a little dossier about those people. And the next time there was a political rally in some other city that the government didn't want to happen, when those people turned up at the airport or the train line or the bus station, they would just be turned away because their name was in the database as this person's not allowed to go to St. Louis this week because in St. Louis there's a WTO meeting.
But this is happening in Europe.
Yeah, well, what do you think about that? Is that a good idea? Well, what are you doing about it?
It's different here.
Yeah, okay, there's known cases, so what are you doing about it? Do you guys have a functioning democracy here?
Well, we developed 15 functioning democracies.
What was that?
We have 15 functioning democracies. The problem is, whenever you move in Europe, you're traveling to a different country.
Okay.
So all of these things which you say you don't worry when you travel to another country, you're happy to show ID. Well, that's what happens to us. The only difference is what you would consider as a state is a country in our case.
Mm-hmm. I didn't say I was happy to show ID, by the way.
Yeah, well.
Basically, I'm not going to fight that issue in this court case. Okay, but it did seem to me that in Europe you guys got the right to cross those borders for at least a couple of years before 9/11.
Yeah.
If you didn't, maybe you ought to work on getting that fixed. Okay, and I don't know what the right way to do that is, whether it's doing it through politics, doing it through parties, doing it through rallies, doing it through court cases. I have a lot more experience at pushing the American political and legal system than I do the European. But you guys are a lot of the people who care about civil rights and care about how well your society protects your own generation and the next generation. And you ought to start thinking about how to fix this, because none of us are getting any younger, right? Time passes and things can either get better or worse.
There are no other ways to fix it in this society or system than to go forward after a attack and after they help you out on that. Usually people who do that go forward get their rights and then have it anyway, and from that we probably much again.
Okay, so in the United States court system, what happens is if you can show that there's a pattern of these rights being violated, you can get the court to order that agency to stop doing that. And if it violates that order, the federal marshals come in and they stop them from doing that. Now, I don't know what the corresponding thing is here, and I understand it's complicated because you've got multiple federal levels of government.
Obviously, you could not call those markets
Obviously, you could not make those markets to come to the airport and make the people who stop you from identification stop them, asking you for an identification. So it obviously doesn't work like that in America either.
I couldn't stop them in the moment.
Yeah, right? You can go to court afterwards and they say, hey, you were actually right, they shouldn't be allowed to stop you, but they did. And everybody else anyway.
Well, see, part of what I'm going to do in this court case is ask the court to order the agencies to stop doing this. And what happens if the court issues that order and the agencies violate it, then anybody whose rights were violated by that can go back to my same judge and say, this agency is violating that order and I want you, judge, to immediately stop them. Because it's not a case where nobody knows what the rules are. We've gone through the process of spending years deciding what the law says and what's allowed. And if the judge says this is what the law is and this is what's allowed, and the agency does something different, you can do a very rapid turnaround to get that fixed. You can't do it the first time, but you can do it the second or third or fifth time. So can I fly now without an ID without problems? The answer is no, because the court case is still in the process. And until, the government basically, there's a presumption in favor of what they call the status quo, which is a shortened form of the Latin version of what's already happening. The presumption is that whatever's currently happening is okay until the court says it's not. Now, I can convince the court 2 weeks from now, issue an order that says, while this case is pending, you stop checking IDs. I think the chance of that is pretty low. Because the courts tend to defer to the government, tend to think the government is relatively honest. And sometimes it is. But by the end of the case, the judge will make a final order, and that final order will be binding on the agencies.
One problem we do have here, one problem we do have here in Europe is that inside of the European Union, you can't cross the border without a passport. If you are an EU citizen, it just so happens that that's precisely one document you can use to prove that you are an EU citizen, and I'm sure you can get this one.
Yes. In the United States, well, they have the same sort of tension about illegal aliens versus people lawfully admitted versus people who are citizens. But the presumption is if they can't show that you're an illegal alien, they have to give you the rights of a citizen. But if you appear to be an alien, but you've got the paperwork that says, look, here's my visa, I was lawfully admitted, and you can show it to the cop, then they can't treat you like an illegal alien. So, if you're a citizen, if you're a citizen who doesn't speak English very well, it might be good, to have your, to avoid problems, to carry something around that shows you're really a citizen. But they can't arbitrarily assume, that just because you don't have your passport, you're not a U.S. citizen. In the EU, in the EU, what is the presumption? If you walk in without documents,
Exactly. There was rarely stopping. Well, not stopping the data.
well, as he was pointing out, the same thing is true in the United States, right? They stopped me, and I'm a citizen, and I have rights, and I have to go to court to get them back. So, but I'm glad to hear that in practice you can most of the time walk around without papers here.
So I have a question. Apparently, apparently data can be stored for a long time in America for federal institutions. And I read in this book from Michael Moore, Stupid White Man, that Ashcroft had this idea to delete data from people who buy guns after 48 hours. What about this plan?
Actually, this is a long-running controversy. In the United States, the First Amendment sort of gets more precedence than anything else in the Bill of Rights. It came first, and it's got the basic speech and the press and religion and all of that protected. But the Second Amendment protects people's right to have guns, because the country was founded by people who used guns to take it away from the previous government they didn't like. And in general, the model is that not that the government runs things, but that the people run things, and that the people can change the government if enough of them don't like it. And most of the time they don't change it, because they like it well enough. Sometimes they do. But there have been many attempts by the government to restrict that right to own guns. And one of the attempts happened during President Clinton's administration. And it was this idea that the courts had found that if someone is a felon, they've committed a felony, a serious crime, and they've gone to prison for it, or paid whatever penalty they had to pay for it, they could still be prevented from buying guns after that. As maybe only for violent felonies or whatever. There's a category of people who, once they've gone through the system and proved they're irresponsible, that it's okay to make a law that says those people can't have a gun. And so the federal government proposed this national instant background checking system that whenever anybody went in to buy a gun, that they would show an ID and their records would get sent to Washington, and within 2 days an answer would come back whether this guy was a felon or not, and they could go and pick up the gun.
Will this data be deleted after this?
Well, this was very fiercely fought over in Congress because a lot of people own guns in America. And this is partly because a large part of America is rural, and the cops aren't always there to protect you, either from other humans who are more dangerous animals or from the less dangerous animals. And so having your own gun is just a useful thing if you've got big animals roaming around in the wild. Anyway, so part of the compromise in Congress was there's this big fear that the government is going to come around and finally try to take away the right to own guns. And that one thing that makes that much easier is if they have a record of everybody who has them. And so people object to building a big database of everybody who has guns and everybody who doesn't. So part of the idea of this background check is system was it was never going to be used to build a database of who had the guns in the day. And what was written into the law was that these records would be destroyed immediately after the answer went back to the gun shop, or within 48 hours, or it's like they keep backup tapes to that computer or something, and they recycle them every 48 hours. Well, the Clinton administration wasn't a particular fan of gun rights, and they didn't do that. They set up the national background check system, and then they kept all those records, even though the law said they should be destroyed. And they kept them for years, and the National Rifle Association sued them. And lots of people complained, and lots of congressmen complained, and they kept the records anyway. And when the Clinton administration lost the election, whether or not you think they lost it fair and square or not, when the Bush administration came in, the Bush administration was of political opinion that said people are allowed to have guns and the government's not allowed to take them away. And they wiped out those records, and they wiped out each new set of records within 2 days. And so that's what's happened there. So there's one other thing that so I've spent a lot of time talking about this court case. Last time I was in a court case like this, which sort of pitted fundamental constitutional rights against some secretive government agency practice that was restricting them. It was the Bernstein case about the right of people to publish encryption software. That case took us 6 years to come to a final win. Right? It took several years in the lower court to get the first decision that kicked it out of the State Department, and then the government moved the regulations into the Commerce Department. It took another year to get it kicked out of there, and then the government appealed it. And it took a couple of years to get a 3-judge panel to agree that we were right, that this regulation had to go. And that last delay was mostly because one of the judges was on our side, one of the judges was on the government side, and the third judge just couldn't decide. And he sat there in the middle for 18 months, and eventually he wrote a 1-paragraph concurring opinion that said, essentially, God, I wish the Supreme Court would decide this one, but meanwhile I'm going to side with these guys. And so, on the strength of that particular vote, we won that case, and now in the United States we publish encryption software. But it took 6 years. It's only been a little over a year since I filed this suit. And I'm expecting it will take another, 3, 4, 5, 6 years before the whole thing is over. So it's not going to be swift, but it eventually, I hope, will come to the right answer. Let's see. So the other question is, some of you may have heard there was a separate incident relating to my ability to travel in the last few weeks. And that's because since I've been doing this case and working on civil rights issues around the war on terrorism, I've been, my friend Andy, who's sitting over here in the corner, found the button that she thought I would enjoy, and indeed I did. The button, so I'm wearing it now, says suspected terrorist. And it has a little outline image of an airplane in the background. And what this means, I don't know what it meant to Andy, she could tell you that if you really want to know, but what it means to me is that all of us are suspected terrorists. We're all treated as if we were suspected terrorists. And the U.S. government has lost the ability to tell a true terrorist from a suspected terrorist. Right? Once you're a suspect, they treat you as if you were a terrorist. Right? They will search you, they take away your rights, they'll lock you up in prisons outside the United States, not let you have access to lawyers, not give you access to free trials. It's like, do we know if those people are terrorists or not? No, we have no idea whether they're terrorists. They haven't been to a trial. They're all sitting with hoods over their heads in a cage. and every time I walk onto an airplane, I feel like I've been treated like a suspected terrorist. Because why would they search an innocent person? Right? The only reason they're searching me is because they suspect that I'm a terrorist. So I have an attitude about this, and I wear the button to start conversations about it. And I wear the button all around, and people look at it, and some of them think it's a joke, and some of them think it's serious, and anyway, we get into a conversation about what's the proper balance between thinking people are innocent and subjecting real terrorists to punishments. Yes.
But isn't this the point, that hitting or striking the right balance? That a lot of your fellow citizens will say, well, this is a special situation and a war against terrorism and we have to protect ourselves, so you have to scale back your rights for the benefit of us all. Isn't this a line of argumentation? And
Certainly, yeah, and it's a good line of argumentation and we should argue about it. But my argumentation is that the United States has made it through more than 200 years of much worse times than we've had in the last 2 years. I mean, we fought civil wars, we fought world wars, we fought the British and the French many times over in just populating our own continent, right? We fought with the Spanish over Mexico. We've had all sorts of terrible problems. We've had plagues, we've had typhoons, we've gone through lots of terrible times and we didn't have to destroy the Constitution. So why is it that flying a plane into a couple of buildings means we have to destroy the Constitution? Okay, that's my basic response to that. And, if you want a more nuanced response, okay, we have a war on terrorism. When will that war be over? When will we get our rights back? Tuesday. The war on drugs has managed to persist for quite a while now. It's been close to 40 years that we've been fighting a war on drugs, and drugs seem more popular than ever. And my suspicion is that the way the U.S. is going around the world trying to root out terrorism is that terrorism is going to become more popular than ever. Which is exactly what the people who want to turn the American country into a police state want. Right? They want more planes flying into buildings. They want more terrorist incidents because that provides more excuses to make a police state, to make more government control over what every individual person can do. Right? It's this sort of thing where, in the drug war, the ordinary people would probably let the drug war be over. I mean, the price of drugs would drop for the people who abuse them. The people who don't use them, they'd stop paying for prisons. There wouldn't be all this gang violence on the streets over who gets to sell the drugs in this block. Right? But there are these two big vested interests that keep the drug war going. And one of them is people who sell drugs who like the price being high. And the other is the people who catch people who sell drugs, who like having money and power. And it's the same sort of thing in the war on terrorism, right? It's good for terrorists and it's good for terrorist catchers, but it isn't good for the rest of us. Right? The people who want to destabilize society, boy, it used to be, you blow something up and, it wouldn't even really get much coverage in the newspapers, but, nowadays, blow up a bus in Israel, and it's like worldwide, there's all, Jakarta, something happens in a hotel, and worldwide there's big headlines. Look, terrorism, everyone be afraid! Isn't that a great encouragement to people who want to make a political impression by acts of violence? That they can get worldwide headlines for doing some small thing to some small number of people. It also sells newspapers, by the way, which is what makes the press so, part of the problem here. The more people are afraid, the more they need to know what's the latest thing to be afraid of. Do I need to be more afraid today or less afraid today? I better buy a paper and find out. So I wore this button, flying to Europe this month. I was coming to this conference, but I was mostly coming for vacation and to see friends and travel around and do things. We'd never been to Paris, and we wanted to come personally thank the French for putting their thumb in George Bush's eye. Anyway, we booked our travel and we got a British Airways flight, and we went in with our passports and we got our boarding passes and we went through security, and the magnetometer didn't even beep over the button. I didn't take it off and run it to the X-ray machine. I didn't take my shoes off either. Right? There's this idiocy in the United States now where, again, actually they have published the rules on the website. The rules are, most people aren't required to take their shoes off when going through the magnetometer. But some kinds of shoes that are on the secret list of shoes known to be worn by terrorists, you have to take off. But the only way to find out what shoes are on that list is to go through a magnetometer and see if they make you take them off. But nevertheless, despite the fact that you're not required to take them off, there are people who talk to you while you're in line waiting to go through here who say, everything will go smoother if you take all your shoes off. Everyone should just take their shoes off. They don't tell you that you have the right not to, but since I read the website, I knew it, so I told them that I wasn't going to do it, and they looked at my sandals and said, yeah, okay. So I went through the magnetometer, the button was fine, nothing showed up in the X-ray machine. They didn't even make me open up my laptop and prove that both battery days were not filled with explosives. And they let me on the plane, and we sat on the plane, and they pulled away from the gate, and they were taxiing out to the runway. And one of the stewards, which is the masculine version of stewardess, one of the guys who runs around and serves you drinks, came up to me and said, could you take off that button? And I was nice to him. I've gotten better at dealing with authority figures over the years. So I just said no. He said, well, it's an upsetting button, and I'm ordering you to take it off. And I said, well, it's a political statement, and you don't have the right to order me to stop making political statements. Right? I didn't have to elaborate. We are still on the ground in the United States, and I'm a United States citizen, and we have rights here, even though I'm on a British Airways flight. I didn't say that part. I just said no. And he went away. And I talked to the passengers around me at this plane, None of them had ever noticed the button before. It's kind of small. But then, they noticed it after that. None of them had a problem with it. I offered one of them one for themselves. They didn't know. So about 5 minutes goes by, and the plane's still taxiing around out there, positioning itself for takeoff. And the captain comes down the aisle and says, hi, I'm Captain Peter, somebody or other, and I'd like to ask you to take off that button. And I said, no, it's a political statement, etc. He said, well, violating federal law by writing that. And I said, no. And he went away. I thought, well, good, okay, you know, I mean, you have these problems in organizations, you eventually have to get to the level where sanity prevails, right? You know, eventually somebody will go, this is idiocy, why are we doing this? We'll all just go away. And I thought that I hit that level. But I was wrong. Because a couple minutes later, they did this announcement on the PA system that said, you know, we've had a small security incident, there's nothing to be panicked about, but we're going to turn around and go back to the gate for a minute. So they turned the plane around, they taxied it back to the gate, and, you know, somewhere in there, I realized, you know, this was a full flight and they couldn't see Annie and I together, so Annie is sitting like 15 rows behind me. Her nose is buried in the newspaper, and she has no idea what's going on. So there was a stewardess, you know, floating around, pouring water for people and stuff like that. And I said, you know, there seems to be, you know, we're having this dialogue up here. Can you go back and tell my friend, you know, that this is going on? Because she might be concerned, especially if she gets to London on a plane and I'm not there. So this woman went back and talked to Annie. Took her 2 tries to find Annie, and eventually she found her. She actually, Annie had a little dialogue with her, which I don't know the whole story, but one of the pieces of it was that when the stewardess told her that the stewardess thought that maybe the ground security people had put the button on me to notify the flight crew. If I was a suspected terrorist, then they should watch me extra carefully. So they took the plane back to the gate, and the original steward who had a problem with me says, you know, get your bags, get your carry-on stuff, and come out, you know, to the gate. And he went back and got in and got her to get her stuff, etc. And they took us out to the gate, where, you know, we step off the plane, and there's a woman there, Carol, I forget her last name too. It's all written up online, you can find it. If you go to freetotravel.org, it has full coverage of both this incident and the court case. And this woman says, hi, I'm the station manager for British Airways here, which is the senior person in the airport for British Airways. And my understanding is that, you know, you were asked by a steward to take the button off, and you were asked by the captain, and you wouldn't. And so what's happened is the captain has told me that he refuses to carry you as a passenger. And in such a circumstance, and you know, I confirmed that the steward was right, that it happened that way. She said, well, under the circumstances, you know, I have no choice but to take you off the plane because the captain won't carry you, and you know, therefore, you know, that's what I have to do.
Did they take your luggage off the plane?
Yes. No, they took the luggage off, and she explained this to me. You know, and I said, you know, fine, you know, they didn't have to drag me out of my seat or anything. I went along quietly. I told her, you know, right, you know, okay, you have to take me off the plane. Here I am. You know, I'm not making any, you know, you don't need physical guards to do this or whatever. I'm fine. And you know, and she said, okay, so you know, she let the plane go without me. And and she said, so meet me back at the ticket counter way out front, where we're taking your luggage off the plane. We'll give it back to you back up there, and we'll deal with either putting you on another plane or getting a refund or something. Okay, and then there dealing with the plane and stuff, and we were free to walk back up through the jetway and back to the airport. Right? It's like no cops, no TSA. It's like we just walked back up and we're just wandering around in the secure area of the airport. It's like they thought we were dangerous. Why didn't they watch us? Clearly, they didn't think we were dangerous. What they thought was that we had expressed a political statement that they didn't like. So on our way back up, we called my lawyer and asked him what our rights were and got him to call British Airways and various other things. And we went back and went to the front, and indeed they had taken our luggage off and they gave it to us. And she was off dealing with some other incident that eventually came back and talked to us and said, okay, so we have a second plane that's flying to London today, and we could put you on it if you'll follow these rules. I've talked to my security people, and this is what we've come up with. First, you have to take the button off and give it to one of us, give it to one of the flight crew, and they will give it back to you at the other side. And second, we have to search you and do a hand search through your carry-on luggage to make sure you don't have any other buttons in there. Otherwise we can't put you on this plane. And I said, well, I understand that you couldn't put me on the first plane because the captain refused to carry me. But I don't understand what rule I violated that's keeping me off the second plane. And no captain has looked at me, no captain has decided whether I can fly or not. I'll be happy to talk to the captain of the second plane and ask him whether he supports the right of people to wear political buttons on his plane. And she said, no, the captain's way too busy to talk to you, of course, ignoring the fact that the other captain did come back and talk to me. And besides, I made this decision, right? This is not the captain's decision. I've decided on my authority that we won't let you on that plane unless you follow these instructions. And I said, well, I'm not willing to follow that. And it turned out they were actually holding the second plane until they went through this process with me and decided whether to let me on. Two guys, while we were going through this, two guys came running up to the British Airways counter. They were really happy that this happened, because they got on the plane. The other guys could have missed. But they let the plane go, and they gave us back our original tickets, which they had somehow saved, and sent us on our way. And so we went home and wrote the whole thing up, while we could remember it, and started trying to book plane reservations on other airlines. And eventually, found a good reservation 2 days later that only cost, it was actually a better price, and it was on Virgin Atlantic, but only 2 days later. So don't fly British Airways, fly Virgin Atlantic. And now, one of the things you'll notice is that they kicked Annie off the flight even though she didn't do anything. Right? Her crime was guilt by association.
She's familiar.
And another of the things to notice is that I wore the buttons on Virgin Atlantic and went through all the same security procedures and got on the plane and flew, and it was no problem, and no one said a word about the button, and no passengers panicked, and no planes fell into the ocean, and it was all fine. And actually, Annie wore a button. On that first one she didn't, but on the second one she wore a button. And we decided, well, okay, so when I was talking to this Carol, the head of BA, I said, well, okay, so I'm trying to figure out, how not to get kicked off BA planes here, right? What do I have to do? It's like, you don't like this button. Suppose I wore a button that said, hooray for Tony Blair. Right? Would it be okay to fly? And she said, yeah, that would be okay. And I said, well, suppose I had one that said, terrorism is bad. And she, well, maybe, you know. And I said, well, suppose I had one, and she said, well, we can spend all day on hypotheticals here, you know. I don't want to talk about this. So Annie wore a button, just to sort of put another fact situation into the mix. And her button said, make pretzels, not war. And luckily, we didn't ever have to find out, you know, that on Virgin Atlantic it was okay to be anti-war, but not okay to be anti-terrorism. Yeah. We thought there was probably a dividing line between the two, but we weren't sure. So that's the story of what happened there, and this has been covered in various blogs. It's been covered in various newspapers and magazines, things like that. It turns out, you know, I've read a lot of the comments that people put in on the blogs, and it's horrifying, because about 60% of people who post something that say, well, first of all, everybody who posts something says Gilmore was an asshole for doing this. Right? A universal opinion. And I can tell by the lack of laughter that you agree with them. But about 60% of the people who posted said these airlines had every right to throw him off that airplane. Right? The captain's word is law, and he was threatening, you know, they were very touchy about terrorism, and you don't want to push their buttons, and we're not allowed to say bomb in an airport, and blah, 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 you know. And about 20% aren't really sure what to think, and about 20% are horrified at the whole thing, that you can be kicked off an airplane for a political statement on your t-shirt or on your button or whatever. Right, so percentages are not really in my favor here. But I'm glad there's 20% of the people on the blogs who think that there's a problem with that situation. The other interesting part of it, which I didn't actually realize until after the whole thing had gone through, was there's a magazine that did coverage of the court case. It's called Reason Magazine. It's a libertarian magazine. I'm not totally fond of it, you know, but I don't subscribe to it. But they covered my case, so I had a couple of copies of it. I was going to show them. In fact, they're back in the bed. I forgot to bring one. I'm a cover story on that issue. Okay, it has a big picture of me. It was taken by a friend of mine in Mexico. On the cover, looks, it's this big, looks like me. and the cover story title is Suspected Terrorist. So this magazine was sitting in my bag, right? Maybe I should have just taken off the button and took out the magazine. And then they're going to say, I'm sorry, sir, you can't read that magazine on this. It's like I already pointed out to the steward that, like, if they were going to ban mentions of terrorism on airplanes, they ought to get rid of all those newspapers everybody was reading. But it didn't seem to have any effect on it. Part of what it pointed out to me is just how far the idiocy has gone in the air traffic, in the air transportation system. That they can be pushed so far off balance by somebody wearing a launch button that they would actually turn a plane around and put them back on the ground because of an innocent button. Right? Because I don't fly around the United States, because I'm not willing to show an ID there. You know, if I went wandering around the United States showing IDs, and the government came in and said, well, this guy's just trying to be a jerk in the court, right? He doesn't really have a court case. He's willing to show his ID. Right? So for the duration of the case, I can't go around showing IDs to the United States to get on planes. Right? And the result is I can't travel very much. Right? So I've done a lot of staying at home when I do board meetings by telephone. And, you know, the companies I invested in muddle along without me checking up on them. The nonprofits that I'm involved in, you know, get less of my guidance, and my family sees less of me. And my friends see less of me, and I do less tourism. Right? In order to correct this problem in the system, I have to let the system restrict me. I have to be a victim of the system. Right? To show the courts what happens to somebody who won't show an ID. What happens is a big part of their life gets cut off. And I'm living that life. And it's not easy on me, and it's not easy on any. But I couldn't find any other volunteers who were willing to do it. Every other sucker I ever talked to is willing to do any goddamn thing to get on their planes. They'll take their shoes off, they'll drink their breast milk. Right? If the TSA told them to stand on their head while they flip their way through the magnetometer, they'd do it. Because they don't want to miss the plane. But there's one person in America who's willing to miss the plane to get their fundamental rights back, and it's me. So, any questions? In the back with the microphone. Do I have any more buttons? I have a very small number of buttons here. One of the criteria that I use in giving them out is I will only give them to people who will wear them on airplanes. But it turns out you can buy these buttons. And from the same place I did. They cost $1. And they're made by a woman named Emmy Koyama, who's an activist in Seattle, Washington. The website where you can get them is eminism.org. It's like feminism without the F. And she has an online store, and in the store is Emmy's Buttons, and under the Emmy's Buttons link is the, I think it's the miscellaneous anti-classist, anti-racist buttons. And among those is the suspected terrorist button. And so you can buy it. If you buy more than about a dozen of them, she'll give you a discount. You can get them for half price. And so I get them like in boxes of 100. Maybe not.
John?
Yeah.
I spoke to you already. I have a flight Monday going to Heathrow and then back to the States. I'd like to be an asshole too.
I don't actually care what airports you fly through, as long as you wear them through airports. Okay, you can wear them on the continent, you can wear them in the United States, right? I mean, you can get your own button and wear it wherever you want to, you can ignore the whole issue, but the ones I'm giving out to people, since they're in short supply, I've discovered that the number of people who would like to wear one for fun is much greater than the number of people who will wear one to an airport.
John, I might want to talk about the bio-ID shit that these people are going to have to face in 13 months coming to the USSA.
The bio what?
The bio-passport crap. Are you aware?
I hear there's a deal where EU people who want to enter the United States will have to have a passport that meets certain qualifications. And many of the recently issued passports do, but people who have like a 10-year-old passport might have to get another one, or else, rather than get easy entry just by showing a passport, you have to apply for a visa in advance and go through, pay $100 and go through a bunch of bullshit.
And a year after that, you have to have a different passport, apparently, that now has your iris print, your fingerprint, and maybe DNA in it.
Okay, I mean, my suspicion is if the European Union told the US of A to fuck off and die, this requirement would be quietly dropped, right? But they would not actually stop everyone from entering and exiting between the United States and the EU. But this actually requires some backbone among the people in the EU to say, you know, which backbone they have not shown, by the way, on the issue of passenger privacy. They're violating every EU privacy directive by sharing all the passenger name records from all your travel reservations with unlimited access to the US government, even though it violates your own laws. Right? So, given that they've already knuckled under on that one, and you guys haven't fixed it, then they will probably knuckle under on this one, and it will be up to you guys to fix it. I mean, I wish I could fix your countries too, but I'm busy working on them. Who's next?
It's me. Over here. Here? Okay, I'd like to tell you a short story about Europe, because we got our problems over here too. And we got our terrorists too. And in Germany there's a special law for asylum seekers. And if you're an asylum seeker who got granted asylum in Germany, you're still not allowed to leave the area you live in there. It's got a radius of about 30 kilometers, and you've got to have the permission to leave that area, even though you've been here for 10 years or so. So I think this is not only a problem of the US, we got our own problems over here, and there's this solidarity with those people, because they excluded from a large part of society anyway. And I think it's even harder to pay attention on that, because if you're involved, you're one of those intelligent white men, like in a superior position anyway. So in a superior position because of this society, you know, that's like.
I think there are plenty of superior colored women in the world.
Yes, sure, but as a male, you're still more powerful. There are kinds of hierarchies. So that's what I wanted to say. I didn't want to say anything about. I didn't want to tell this sexist, racist crap. You know?
Yeah.
It's a matter of society, not of biology or whatever. Okay, so this is and there's even cases of people violating this law, traveling to demonstrations, to congresses and so on, and some have even been expelled from Germany for that cause. So some of us are laughing at the US for the laws on terrorism that they are enforcing, but don't have a look at their own laws. So that's what I wanted to point out.
One of the things I have to tell this audience, by the way, is in the United States, I mean, we have the same problem in the United States. They look around at all these other countries and say, look at all the crazy, unfree things that are happening out there. We are the beacon of freedom and the light of freedom. We are invading other countries to bring them freedom, freedom, freedom. Right? And most of the people in America believe that. Okay? It's a terrible thing, but it's true. That they've been brainwashed into thinking that theirs is the most free country no matter what it does. That even if they destroy the Constitution word by word, that we will still be the best and the freest and the most powerful and the place everybody wants to go. Right? And I tell all my friends, get out of the United States, go travel around and meet people from the rest of the world. And what I discovered is most of them are kind of happy where they are. They're not all beating at the door of the United States trying to get in. They kind of like their own political systems and they don't want to have ours imposed on them. It's a big world out there and we're only on the east side. But most Americans don't know that from personal experience. When you grow up in Europe, you tend to have a much broader experience of different cultures, different countries. It's much more homogeneous in the United States.
Okay. So, in a perfect world, passport could go in Finland 3 years old or 9/11. Are you finished? Yeah. This of course is finished still. And that was enough for them.
I couldn't quite understand that.
Yeah, so basically, to get in Finland, you just had to speak Finnish. You didn't have to show your passport or anything.
To get into Finland, you don't have to show your passport.
Yeah, just speak Finnish.
Oh, if you speak Finnish, yeah.
That's pretty good.
It's like a secret society where you know that.
You said that was the case. It's no longer.
Okay. Anyone else?
Okay, this is sort of follow up on what we said before about societal status. So I think for you, I take it that you engage in 6-year lawsuits all the time, and from my background knowledge, I take it that you have support from the ACLU, that you have support from the EFF. So this is not. I think I don't know. When you were asking what have you done against the same thing in Europe, I think it is not easy here because we lack a strong civil rights movement, and because the personal background of most people here is not as such that they can afford to have a 6-year lawsuit going against the government.
Okay.
So, well, do you have any advice on things to do besides suing government?
Oh, well, okay. Yeah, I can talk to that, but first let me correct a few misimpressions. I do a 6-year lawsuit about the government about once a decade. It's not really that common an occurrence in my life. So far, this is the second, so I can't really say it's setting a major precedent. Second thing, the first lawsuit was done by EFF. And I'm a co-founder of EFF, and I was part of the team that advised the lawyers on strategy and all of that and helped them with the case. But, it wasn't just me doing it. And we got support from a wide variety of places, including commercial companies, people who had made money in computers and cared about this issue, people who cared about privacy, our individual members. We got support from all kinds of people. We got volunteer lawyers coming and help from various law firms. In the current case, in my case for freedom of travel, I talked to the ACLU, and they wouldn't help. And I talked to EFF, and they wouldn't help. I talked to a bunch of places that work on civil rights, and none of them would do this case. And the reason that most of them gave me for it was that they thought it would lose. And the reason they thought it would lose was because we're in a war against terrorism, we're fighting a war in Afghanistan. In times of war, the courts are more likely to approve violations of civil rights, and we don't want to do this case and have it lose and set a precedent that says the government can restrict anybody's travel at any time. Well, I tried to point out to them, if you let the government restrict everybody's travel now, they're getting it anyway. They won't get much more out of it by you losing the court case. But they wouldn't do it. So I had a harder decision to make, and the harder decision was to do it myself and to find lawyers who I could hire who would do it. I found 2 lawyers who I can hire, and who both work on it part-time. And I found 1 lawyer who's a law professor who is volunteering his time to help with the case, because he thinks it's interesting, and he and I have worked together on other civil rights things. And that's all the support I've got. Right? A few people now. EFF has 1 guy, now 2 guys, who are working on these issues, these sort of privacy, wiretapping, anti-terrorism, all of that whole ball of issues. two guys working on it. Everybody else in there is working on intellectual property issues. Everybody else is trying to beat the NCA. It's to kill off TCPA. It's to make it safe to have it in the radio. Right? It's to make it safe to record television programs, to have cameras. Right? Those are a big issue for us, and our membership has doubled and doubled again over the last 2.5 years because we're working on those issues. But CFF is the only organization that's really standing up for the rights of ordinary citizens to do reasonable things with music, and to do reasonable things with consumer electronics and reverse engineering and all of that. And so we're getting a really strong message from our members of the EFF that says, keep working that issue. We can't bear to let all the anti-terrorism issues just go past us. Right? So we've got a little force in the corner, 2 out of 20 people working on it. But they don't have the time to do a major case on it. Right? What they're doing is analyzing bills that go into Congress and posting analyses of them and submitting comments every time the government publishes a terrible idea that says it's a terrible idea and things like that. And then they work their way up to finding a good court case to do. ACLU and EFF and I talk about this case all the time, and they're very supportive of the fact that I'm doing it. But I didn't actually ask them to do it because it's not an internet rights issue, right? And that's really what their purpose is civil rights and electronic media. This is a more general civil rights issue. And ACLU ought to be the people who would do it. What happened actually, at about the same time I filed this case, ACLU has chapters all over the United States, and their Northern California chapter filed a case on behalf of the people who search you in airports, suing the government for trying to fire them for not being citizens. Right? I'm trying to get the ACLU interested in suing the government for searching people at all as they go through airports, for demanding their IDs, and they are in there defending the labor rights of non-citizens to search us citizens in the airport. So I think they got their priorities a little screwed up. And I'm all for the rights of laborers not to be discriminated against. But, if I was them, I'd be putting the effort into protecting the right to travel and not worrying about the right of non-citizens who are working in the airports to do this. So, I think if I had the support of one of these organizations, I'd probably do a better job on the case, right? I'd have lawyers who have more experience in constitutional cases. I'm doing the best I can, and I'm trying to uphold it for all of you guys. If you know any great constitutional lawyers who want to work on this kind of stuff, send them to me. I might even be able to pay them. Yeah. Actually, wait, before I get to your question, he asked another question, which is, for all the people who can't afford to do court cases, what should we do? Well, one thing you could do, and part of the reason I can afford to do court cases is because I was around at the beginning of EFF, and the reason EFF got founded fundamentally was because Mitch Capor, who was founder of Lotus Corporation, helped design Lotus 123, put $500 million a year into EFF, in addition to whatever else we could raise from other people to keep it alive for the first 3 or 4 years. And I had made some money out of Sun Microsystems, but I hadn't made enough money that I could put that kind of money into keeping an organization alive to protect civil rights. And so part of my decision about what to do with my life was, I could have just taken the money that I got from the Sun, moved to a desert island and sip margaritas the rest of my life and read interesting books. One of the things I decided to do was go out and start my own startup to try to make some more money. Because I realized next time something came around that I really cared about in civil rights, I wanted to be in a position where where I could spend $500,000 a year for a couple of years to make sure it got fixed. And I put 6 years of my life into Sigma support, which we eventually, at the end of the 90s, sold to Red Hat. And I made enough money out of that that I could afford to do this. But it was a conscious choice. Right? And you guys can make conscious choices too. Some people, you know, at Sun I looked into the making money. Right? I took the job because it was technically interesting, and it turned out they turned into the world's biggest computer company or something. Right? But at Sigma's I deliberately went into it with one goal being to make enough money that I could afford to defend civil rights. And when you make your own life choices, you can decide, you know, oh, I want to be an academic and have the freedom to work on the things I care about. Or I think that's a great platform to work on the technical issues of civil rights, or I want to make money in business, or I want to do this, I want to write great software that changes the world. Everybody has to figure out what they're good at and what lever they want to apply on the world to leave their mark on it. Maybe all you want to do is be a great parent and raise great kids, right? Whatever it is you want to do, maybe you want to give good massages, right? And have all the people around you be more relaxed in their life. Right? Whatever it is you want to do, it's a decision to make. What I decided I wanted to do was see if I could apply my business skills, build up a pot of money that could be used for civil rights. And I was lucky enough, you know, I was particularly lucky to sell a company close to the top of the bubble. So it made more money than it would have otherwise. But, you know, the rest of it was a conscious decision to go into it. Now, what can you do if you don't have the money? You haven't gone through starting a startup and spending a decade in it? Again, I don't know the situation as well in Europe as I do in the States, but a lot of the legal work that's done on big precedent-setting cases like this is done for free by lawyers because they love the work. The same way we write free software because we love the software, we love the work. Right? I don't know very many lawyers who like to do the cases where it's insurance company A suing insurance company B over who gets to pay for damages in this car wreck. Right? It's boring to us, it's boring to the courts, and it's boring to them. Right? They really like the idea that with 10% of their time they can go out and protect the rights of the poor to not be discriminated against, or to get a settlement for somebody who got run down by a drunk driver who then ran off and tried to leave them crippled for life, or to work on a civil rights case. And so in the States, part of the standard thing for a lawyer is you're supposed to do some fraction of public service work. It might be just being a public defender for people who have no lawyer and no money for one. It might be these civil rights things, but you can go around, you know, if you like go to a law school, talk to a law professor, or talk to the students there about how this stuff works if you don't know any lawyers. And ask, you know, ask around, or do searches on mailing lists for people who are exploring the law about immigration rights, or the law about ID, or the law about this stuff. And send, you know, find those guys who are posting from a law school and send an email and say, hey, I know these guys who got discriminated against. How would you like to represent them in a court case in the Court of Human Rights or whatever? You know, try to set up these situations and put people together to make it happen. A lot of times all it takes is some coordination and finding the right people.
Okay, so you're from California, and you need a lawyer in California, I guess.
I'm from California. 2 of my lawyers are in California, and 1 is in Florida.
So, because maybe you know a lawyer in California who did a lot of pro bono things in his past. And she's my aunt, actually. So,
okay, well, come up and give me her name.
She's pretty good at this. So. She's here in business, so she's with the government a couple of times, and well, you can just speak to her.
Okay, great. If she's interested in this topic, I'd love to have her help. tired out there? I see a question. Yeah. Oh, why don't you give it to Annie for a minute?
When you agitate for civil liberties like this, of course, there's always the potential for retribution. And so, if you decide to go to an airport and attempt to fly without an ID, I strongly suggest you don't go alone. Bring someone with you. I went with John when he did this. Make sure the person who goes with you takes very careful notes. When we got tossed off the British Airways flight and were escorted to the jetway, I pulled out my camera and started taking photos until they demanded that I put my camera away.
Under what law?
Good question. The name of the pilot was Peter Hughes. The name of the station manager for British Airways was Carol Spear. Take really careful notes. Make sure you know all the officials you dealt with. And if you get tossed off the plane, the first thing you should do is call your lawyer or let someone know what's happening to you. We didn't know whether we were going to be met by security goons at the ticket counter. We were wandering through the terminal, so we stopped and we made a call so that we knew that somebody out there knew what was happening to us. So if you think you're going to find yourself in a situation where you're taking on authorities, let someone know where you are so that you don't disappear into the gulag, because it happens, and it happens in the US, and it's just a good practice. Also, it doesn't hurt to have a little cash outside the bank and a place to go to if you need to.
Who's next?
Okay, I have a question about people from poor countries that don't need visa things to travel to Europe or to America, and that aren't let into our countries because of the fact they are from a poor country. What to do about that?
I don't know what to do about that. Actually, I decided I was deliberately going to skip the whole issue of international travel when dealing with my court case, because it just, it brings in all of these issues that are complicated to solve, and I wanted to try to present them with a really clear, simple fact situation that they can come up with an easy answer to. Even so, it's going to be hard for a court to say, oh, by the way, what the federal government has been doing for the last 6 years, they are going to have to stop.
Here.
Right? Even if all the precedents from the Supreme Court go my way, it's still a hard decision for a judge to make, to say, I'm going to turn around the ship of the United States government on this issue. So I want to make it as easy for them as possible by keeping out as much complication as possible.
John, can I follow up minutes?
Sure.
Oh. Okay. Hello. There. Thank you. My voice is about loud with all this stuff. Here's another answer that John did give you. Okay, and that is that thousands of people have given their lives, their liberty, their fortunes, and their families in the United States to fight for these freedoms. And we have written them down as laws, and we have made them our cultural standards over the last 200 plus years. That's why John focus on just the U.S. and actually make a valid case for this. You folks need to stop whining that the U.S. should save you and do the same in your own nations everywhere if these liberties you wish to have.
Because somebody's going to need to save you from the U.S. Nick? Sonny Bono will rise from the dead. Governor of California. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
Just one thing, I don't think that all the countries ask the United States to help them. I mean, for example, if you look on Africa, for example, there are lots and lots of countries spending money on financing projects in Africa, and like 2/3 of all this money is from the EU and just 1/3 from America. And if you look to other countries, it is like that. Well, if you look at the UN, most of the money that goes into the UN is from Europe, and the money that should be spent by America isn't spent by America to the US. It's just, I think, 50% of the money that America should pay to the UN is paid, and the rest is not paid, and things like that. But nobody complains about that anymore.
Well, they tend to pay it up when they want the UN to do something, and then they slack off again.
That's that thing.
Yeah.
And for example, I don't think that Afghanistan or Iraq asked to be invaded. I mean, of course, the Taliban regime was very, very bad, but I don't think the war was the right choice. So, same in Iraq, I don't think it was the right choice.
Well, actually, I have a question for you guys. One of the things that I didn't realize until I took this 1-month trip to Europe is that many European citizens are held in the Guantanamo prison compound, and they're being held without access to lawyers, without access to their families, as I understand it. And the plan is to try them in front of judges who are sworn to follow the orders of George Bush. What are you guys doing about that?
I don't know. I think nothing will happen because the government doesn't want to do anything, because for example, the German government doesn't want to mess with America anymore, because they're afraid of the consequences, which are that they have they have disadvantages in the economy when they say something against America. That's what they're afraid of.
Behind you, if someone passes back.
I'd like to respond to that because I think the question is not what our governments want to do, because it's people's right being violated, and the idea in America is not if Americans people's rights is violated, then the government helps them. The government might be the problem, and that's the way it is in Europe too. I think a lot of the problems in Europe is that a lot of people here like to point at America and say they're doing that bad stuff, just like you told about America, they are pointing at other countries and saying they are doing the bad stuff. Actually, there's a lot of bad stuff going on here, and I think we should have a look at that. And especially considering this UN stuff, I think there's a different political strategy behind what the EU does, and that's they are not like the good guys who try to save this planet. They've just, they know that inside the UN they got about, 17 votes, and the US only got 1 vote. So the UN, of course, is a better option for Europe, while WTO and such things are a better option for the US. So I think we shouldn't mess with those topics, because we should have a look at people's rights being violated over here and work on that. And I've got an example of how this can work very good, because for me, this racism and deportation issue is very important. It's got to do with things too. And there's a lot of people being deported from Europe to countries where they shouldn't be deported to, which I think. And in this case, this whole thing can work the other way around. Because if there's passengers who say, we won't go, or we won't sit down, we won't put on our seatbelts, as long as there's a person on this flight who is not here voluntarily, the plane cannot leave. And there's been some people saved from being deported because the pilot started to talk to them and finally said, okay, I won't fly this person because it's been tortured in the country I would fly to. And I've been involved into a court case where we saved a woman who was to be deported to Central Africa, where she was a political activist and where she had been tortured before. And now she's finally going to Canada because Canada is accepting her as an asylum seeker. But Europe won't. So it's not like European guys are the good guys and giving all the money to the UN, whereas the US, I mean, okay, I'm provoking a little bit.
I also know that the world is not that easy. The problem is like most people don't get courage. If I was a pilot of, I don't know, American Airlines or something, or Lufthansa for example, and had to deport people, I don't know if I would risk my job to fly these people or to not fly these people to their country and maybe to their death. I think the problem is just the courage. For example, if you look at the democracy in America, I think it was totally annihilated after the September 11th. Now it's slowly recovering. The process of democracy is slowly recovering in America, but it maybe takes another 10 years to the same stage before September 11th.
If we're lucky.
If you're lucky, yeah.
Yeah. It's going to take a lot of hard work to ever get it back to how it was before that.
And maybe it's still there.
Yeah. Okay. Back mic. Sound. Sound guy. Back mic.
Hello? Okay. Someone over there on the question was asking you what could we do if we can't launch a court case. That's a fair point. But there's a separate thing to that. You have the option in the US of taking this sort of thing all the way to the Supreme Court and putting it against the Constitution, which your country has. That's something which most countries in Europe don't have. There is no sort of absolute laws which all others are written. And thus, the kind of thing you're trying to do, which is attacking existing laws, existing government actions, being against that laid down absolute, is something that's not even possible. There's no way to even, we can't bring a case, there's no court to bring a case to. So I say to that person and to all of you, there is one thing that you can do. And what you can do is talk to people that you know, people that you see, and try to make them understand why there are people who care about these issues, and why you care about them, why they should care about them. Because without that, without people caring about this, it doesn't matter how many cases you bring, even in a country that does have a constitution, because people don't care about it. Sooner or later, they can just start ignoring you, and there will be nothing at all that you can do.
Okay. Now, doesn't the EU have a Charter of Human Rights and a court to enforce it?
Yes, in theory. We get to see how effective that might be.
Right. I know that in Canada 20 years ago they did not have a Bill of Rights, and they wrote one and they passed it, and it's called the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And the last 15 years, the courts have spent tossing out laws that violated it.
Exactly.
And one of them recently was the drug laws against use of marijuana in Ontario were declared unconstitutional because they didn't provide for its use as a medicine by people who need it.
The problem with the EU is that its status is somewhat unsure. It's something that's been retrofitted by simply not clear what authority it has and doesn't have.
Right.
It certainly makes itself very busy trying to look important by passing an awful lot of regulations, most of which are hideously bloated and badly thought out and are just, as far as I can tell, they're there to fill time. I think the other thing they're there to do is provide the governments of individual countries with options on what they want to do by, one week saying, we're going to ignore these bits of this European directive because we don't like them. And hey, this is our country, Europe doesn't have power over us, it's not a federal government, this isn't the United States, it's Europe. Right? The next week they can say, right, we're bringing in this law now, we're not running it through Parliament, there'll be no chance to discuss it because we're just implementing this EU directive, we have to.
Right. Yes. I mean, you're in one of these periods where isn't there a Chinese character that means danger and opportunity in the same character? You're in a period where new institutions are being created and their powers are unclear. And this is the time when you have the most influence over what powers are created and how those institutions firm themselves over the years. When the United States was founded, the Supreme Court was not even given the clear authority to declare laws unconstitutional. Right? But within the first few decades, it ended up deciding that it had that power. And the populace backed it up.
Fortunately, that's something I can see the EU doing because that's very much its attitude.
Well, to some degree, you get the political institutions that you deserve. If you think you deserve enforceable civil rights, then you had better put a political process in place that creates them and makes them enforceable. And that's what I'm doing, right? When they violate mine, I go in there and say, "No, I have that right. You're going to give it to me."
What I say again to you personally is make sure that on the other side you're making sure that other people recognize the case that you're making there and don't begin to, you may feel at times that people think you're some kind of nutcase.
I do.
Now, on the one hand, you need to stand up to that and not let it phase you and keep up the fight. On the other hand, the fact that they think that is a problem, and you shouldn't forget that.
Oh, I know. And going into something like this, I mean, it took a lot of serious thought to go into this when I couldn't find any other experienced civil rights organization that could take it. But ultimately, I am much, much more comfortable if I can talk to one other person into going into something with me than if I'm just me all by myself and I can't convince anybody to do it. But sometimes it just comes down to you're the only one who understands it well enough or thinks they understand it well enough or is committed enough to it or whatever. Now, another thing that I wanted to say in response to your comments about the structure in Europe. When I first came to Europe, which was many years ago, I was really surprised by a number of things that are different from the United States. One of the things that I was surprised at is in the US, we have all of these written out rules that say exactly what rights you have. But the government spends all its time pushing to make sure to limit them as much as possible. To walk right up to the line and almost violate them, but not quite. And that's a very different dynamic than what happens in Europe, because you don't have hard and fast lines enforced in stone, so to speak. The pushes happen in both directions, and you tend to come to much more balanced point of view where your police are not constantly pushing to have the ability to arrest anybody at any time for any reason and hold them, because they get shouted down by the populace if they do that. In the U.S., you know, people rely on the courts and on the government structures to kind of prevent that, and they assume the cops are always going to push for the maximum amount of corruption possible. The other advantage you have in the EU, which you are gradually losing, unfortunately, is that all of your countries are small. You can actually know your legislators. You can actually travel to the seat of government. I'm 3,000 miles. I'm 4,000 to 5,000 kilometers from the seat of government in my country. And since I can't fly in the United States, it's kind of hard to go talk to my congressman. But because, you know, it's a smaller society and by a shorter number of connections, you actually know some of the people in power. You can have much more influence than I can have in the United States, or anyone can have in the United States.
But again, only within your country, which is increasingly being sort of held under the power of the EU and the European Parliament, the members of that are very much more tenuously connected to you.
Yeah.
Anyone else from Mike?
Is that a volunteer? No. You're just talking to your friends. Anybody else? Are we done? Okay. Thanks for caring enough to stay up till midnight and talk about this.